By the time I realized something was wrong, my name was already on things I didn't clearly remember agreeing to. We were parked outside the rehearsal space, engine off, my phone still warm from a call I'd ended too fast to explain myself. He stared straight ahead, jaw tight, hands folded the way people do when they're holding something in. Then his face shifted, not dramatically, just enough to register. He said he hadn't expected today to be hard. He said he thought he was past that. I didn't touch him. I waited. I was 44 then, running a mid-sized creative agency I built from a freelance practice into something employable. My money came in waves, good quarters, thin ones, always moving. I lived alone, worked late, and had learned how to keep my personal life efficient. I didn't collect chaos. He was a voice actor. That's how we met. I'd hired him for a regional campaign, one of those jobs that looked small on paper but needed precision. He came recommended. Reliable. Easy to direct, they'd said. He was. In the booth he took notes cleanly. Adjusted tone without ego. When I asked for a different read, he didn't ask why. He delivered it. When the session ran long, he didn't check the time. Afterward, he lingered. Not in a way that felt strategic. He asked how long I'd been doing this. He said my feedback was unusually specific. He said most people spoke in moods, not actions. I noticed how carefully he framed compliments. The crying came weeks later, after a late session. He'd offered to walk me to my car because the lot was dark. He said it automatically, like something he always did. On the way, he mentioned his mother had been sick. Not dying, just declining. He said the kind of illness that rearranged your schedule more than your emotions. In the car, he said the word tired and then stopped speaking. When he apologized, it was immediate. He said he hadn't meant to put that on me. I said it was fine. Because it was. He didn't cry long. He composed himself quickly, embarrassed but not defensive. He said he hated feeling unprofessional. I told him professionalism wasn't a lack of feeling. It was knowing when to keep working anyway. That seemed to land. After that, he checked in. Not constantly. Just enough. He asked how deadlines were holding. He sent an article about vocal strain I didn't need. He said he'd thought of me when he read it. We didn't sleep together right away. He said his life was messy and that he didn't want to pretend otherwise. He said he understood if that wasn't appealing. I told him clarity was appealing. When we finally did, it was quiet. No performance. No promises. The crying didn't repeat. What repeated was the way he let me see strain without asking me to fix it. At the time, that felt like trust. He integrated into my life by being useful in ways that didn't ask for permission. He began picking up overflow work when projects bottlenecked. Not through my agency, he was careful about that, but through adjacent tasks. Scratch reads. Placeholder narration. He said it helped him stay sharp between bookings. I said yes because it solves small problems cleanly. He never invoiced aggressively. He charged modestly, often rounding down. When I asked him to adjust a rate once, he did it without comment. That flexibility made him feel safe to rely on. I noticed how often he talked about holding space. He used the phrase when he described his mother's care team. He used it when he talked about directing sessions. He said good work came from containment, not pressure. He said people performed better when they weren't bracing. That aligned with how I ran my agency. I told myself we shared a philosophy. He learned my schedule quickly. Which days I skipped lunch. Which nights I worked past 10. He didn't interrupt. He adjusted. If he texted, it was with information, not expectation. Links. Availability. Short confirmations. At some point, he began staying over on long nights. Not often. Just enough to be helpful. He said it saved him a commute. He said he liked the quiet of my place. He left early. He made coffee. He didn't rearrange anything. He started talking about his career plateau. He said voice work aged strangely. That your voice matured but your opportunities narrowed. He said he was good at being what people needed, but that he wanted something with more leverage. Production. Coaching. He said he didn't know how to pivot without burning bridges. I listened. I didn't advise unless he asked. When he mentioned an online course he was considering, I looked at it. The price was high for what it offered. I said so. He agreed. He said he was tired of paying to be told he was already good. Later, he mentioned the agency's training budget. He said it carefully as an observation, not a request. He said companies invested in people all the time. He said development was cheaper than replacement. I told him the budget was for staff. He nodded. He didn't argue. A week later, he sent me a proposal. Not a pitch. A document. He'd outlined a pilot workshop for junior talent. Internal. Low cost. He said if it worked, it could become a differentiator for us. He said if it didn't, we could drop it quietly. I read it twice. It was solid. I approved a small stipend, framed it as a trial. He thanked me and asked what metrics I cared about. That question mattered. The workshop went well. Staff liked him. He didn't posture. He listened. He said the right things about process and recovery. He made people feel competent instead of hungry. After that, he started referring to we when he talked about the agency. Softly, not possessively. I didn't correct him. He also started talking more about his mother, her appointments, her confusion. He said he was managing most of it alone. He said siblings were complicated. He said he didn't want to burden anyone. I told him he wasn't a burden. That statement felt true at the time. The first boundary he crossed was framed as care. He said his mother had missed an appointment because he'd mixed up dates. He said it quietly without self-pity. He said it scared him how easy it was to make mistakes when everything depended on one person. He didn't ask for help. He just stated the problem and let it exist between us. The next week, he asked if I could cover one session while he handled paperwork. He said he hated canceling. He said consistency mattered with doctors. I agreed because it was one afternoon. After that, the requests came dressed as logistics. Could he leave some equipment at my place? His apartment was small. Could he use my printer for insurance forms? His had been unreliable for months. Could he forward some calls to my office number temporarily because reception was better? Each request was reasonable. Each one solved something immediate. None of them felt like a shift on their own. What changed was how often my life absorbed the margin. He began scheduling sessions during my lunch hour because it was quieter. He said it helped him focus. I started eating later without noticing. He began asking me to listen to drafts at night because I had a better ear when I wasn't in work mode. I listened while answering emails. He started calling me his anchor. Not publicly, just to me. He said it once, then again weeks later. He said it like an observation, not a compliment. He said some people steadied environments just by being themselves. I didn't contradict him. When his mother's condition worsened, the crisis had shape. Hospital stays, insurance confusion, forms that asked the wrong questions. He said he felt like he was drowning in administrative language. He asked if I could look over something before he submitted it. I did. The forms multiplied. Advanced directives, payment plans, supplemental coverage. I caught errors. I flagged risks. I corrected tone. I was good at it. I told myself that competence was the fastest way through chaos. At some point, he stopped asking if and started asking when. When could I review something? When would I be free to talk? When could we make a decision? The shift was subtle enough to feel like momentum rather than assumption. The first time money moved, it was indirect. He said a reimbursement was delayed. He said it was just a gap. He said he hated interest-bearing solutions for short problems. I offered to front it without calculating. It wasn't a large sum. He said he'd pay me back as soon as the claim cleared. It cleared late. He apologized more than necessary. He said stress scrambled his sense of time. I waved it off. The money returned eventually, rounded with an extra line that said thank you for being steady. After that, the financial edges softened. He stopped worrying aloud about costs. He talked more about bandwidth, emotional labor, burnout. He said he needed to protect his voice. He said rest wasn't laziness, it was maintenance. I believed him because his exhaustion looked real. What I didn't notice at first was how my role had shifted. I wasn't just supporting him. I was absorbing the volatility so he could perform calm. When problems arose, he brought them to me pre-sorted, already shaped for reassurance. He began saying things like, "I don't know what I'd do without you right now." He said it gently, almost gratefully. One night, after a particularly long day, he fell asleep on my couch while I was still working. I looked at him there, shoes off, phone charging, his life arranged around my outlets. I didn't feel trapped. I felt responsible. The rupture came through tone, not action. It was during a session with a client I trusted, one who had worked with my agency for years and rarely escalated. We were reviewing final cuts when he paused and asked lightly whether everything was okay on my end. He said the last few emails had sounded different, less decisive. He said it wasn't a complaint, just a check-in. I told him everything was fine. After the call, I scrolled back through my sent messages. The language was still mine, but something else threaded through it. Softeners, explanations I didn't usually provide, small accommodations that weren't necessary. I recognized the voice. It was the same one I used with him when he was overwhelmed. That was when I noticed how far it had traveled. That evening, he told me his mother's insurance had denied another claim. He said the language was punitive. He said he didn't have the energy to fight it again. He asked if I could handle the appeal because I was better at staying unemotional. I asked when he'd last spoken to the insurer himself. He said it wasn't productive. He said they responded better to authority. He said my position carried weight. I said I wasn't their client. He smiled and said they didn't need to know that. The smile lingered a fraction longer than usual. I told him I couldn't do it. Not because I didn't care, but because it wasn't appropriate. I said he needed to be the point of contact. He nodded. He didn't argue. He said he understood. The next morning, I received a voicemail from the insurer addressed to my office. They referenced an appeal I hadn't filed yet. They thanked me for my advocacy and asked for additional documentation. I listened to the message twice. When I confronted him, he said he'd only listed me as an authorized contact to keep things moving. He said it was temporary. He said he'd assumed I'd be okay with it since I was already involved. I asked him to remove my name immediately. He hesitated. He said doing it abruptly might slow the process. He said the system didn't like reversals. He said it could trigger another review. I said that wasn't my problem. He looked tired then. Genuinely. He said he felt like he was constantly failing people. His mother. Me. Himself. He said he was trying to hold things together and that sometimes he made imperfect choices under pressure. I recognized that explanation. I'd used it myself in other contexts. That night I slept badly. Not because of fear. Because of recognition. Over the next week, small things surfaced. An invoice submitted under my agency's name for his workshop materials that I hadn't approved. A calendar invite sent from my assistant's address that I hadn't dictated. A casual mention to a junior staffer that he and I were sorting out long-term plans. I corrected each thing quietly. Each correction was received with apology, followed by justification, followed by reassurance. He said he didn't mean to overstep. He said stress blurred his edges. He said he trusted me and assumed I trusted him the same way. I realized then that trust to him meant access. The key moment came late one night. I told him I needed space. Not a breakup, just distance. I said my life had become too porous and I needed to close it back down. He listened carefully. Then he said something precise. He said he worried that without him, I'd collapse into work and forget how to be human. He said he'd seen it happen before. He said he'd been protecting me from myself as much as I'd been protecting him. The sentence was delivered gently. It landed hard. I asked him to leave. He didn't argue. He packed his things methodically. He kissed my cheek and said he hoped I'd remember that everything he'd done had come from care. After the door closed, I sat on the floor longer than I meant to, noticing how quiet the apartment felt without someone else's needs vibrating through it. I didn't feel abandoned. I felt unentangled. The unraveling didn't look like revenge. It looked like accounting. The morning after he left, I went into the office early. Not to distract myself. To observe. I opened the shared drive and traced permissions the way I would if something had gone wrong for a client. Slowly. Without assumption. His access was broader than I remembered approving. Not catastrophic. Just generous. Enough to move materials, submit invoices, speak in rooms where language mattered. Enough that intent could be implied without being stated. I revoked it all before 9. By noon, questions arrived. A producer asking why a workshop had been paused. Accounting flagging a reimbursement request they couldn't match to a contract. A junior staffer asking whether she should still coordinate with him on scheduling. I answered cleanly. I said the collaboration had ended. I said nothing more. He called once. I didn't pick up. The next contact came through my assistant. He said he needed to collect equipment. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said he didn't want things to end badly. I told her to arrange a pickup with facilities. I said I wouldn't be present. Later that afternoon, an email arrived from a client thanking both of us for our guidance during a difficult period. The phrasing caught. It wasn't wrong. It was just inclusive in a way that felt earned through repetition rather than agreement. I replied with a clarification. Polite, brief, accurate. That evening, I received a message from him that was longer than the others. He said he was hurt by how quickly I'd shut things down. He said he felt erased. He said he'd given so much of himself to the work and to me. He said he didn't understand how care had become liability overnight. I read it once. Then again, not for content but for structure. There was no acknowledgement of boundaries. Only proximity. Only effort. Only feeling. I didn't respond. Over the next week, small residuals surfaced. A vendor contract signed with his name still listed as facilitator. A staff bio draft that mentioned him in future-facing language. A calendar reminder I hadn't set for a session that no longer existed. Each thing was corrected. Quietly. Without drama. What surprised me was how little resistance there was. No backlash. No fallout. The system adjusted the way systems do when they're relieved of friction they didn't know how to name. He sent one final message. He said he hoped I'd eventually see that he'd never meant to take anything from me. He said he'd only wanted to belong somewhere stable. He said he'd thought we were building something together. That was the sentence that closed it for me. Because building is mutual. What he'd been doing was settling. After that, there was nothing. No apology tour. No warning shots. Just absence. The space he left behind wasn't dramatic. It was workable. What followed felt less like recovery and more like recalibration. I didn't take time off. I didn't need to. My days filled themselves back in the way they always had, meetings, revisions, decisions that held their shape. What was gone wasn't capacity. It was noise. I noticed it first in my body. My shoulders stopped lifting when my phone buzzed. I stopped bracing before opening my inbox. When someone asked for something urgent, I evaluated it instead of absorbing it automatically. That pause felt new and useful. I rewrote one internal policy. Just one. It clarified authorization on behalf of the agency. It was boring. Necessary. I didn't think about him while I did it. At home, I moved the couch back to where it had been before he started sleeping on it. I hadn't realized it had shifted until I dragged it across the floor and felt the room settle. Space does that when it's restored, it exhales. A week later, I ran into him by accident. A coffee shop near the office. He was already seated when I walked in. He looked thinner. Tired but composed. He stood when he saw me, uncertain. He said my name. I nodded. I didn't sit. I didn't ask how he was. He said he hoped I was well. I said I was. Both statements were true. He said he was working less now, focusing on his mother. He said things had clarified. He said he'd learned a lot. I told him I had a meeting. Before I left, he said one last thing. He said he hoped I didn't think he'd been using me. He said he'd never planned to. I looked at him then, not defensively, not kindly. Accurately. I said intention wasn't the same as outcome. He nodded, as if filing that away. When I walked back to the office, I noticed how upright my posture felt. Not tense, aligned, like something had been returned to its proper place. That night I worked late. Not because I had to, because I wanted to finish something cleanly. When I shut down my computer, the office was quiet in the good way. No unfinished emotional threads. No borrowed weight. At home, I turned off the lights room by room. The apartment held. My phone stayed silent. In bed, I didn't think about him. I thought about the work waiting tomorrow and how it belonged to me again.